Hi, we begin a new biblical book today, 2 Samuel. And it is a new book, as you can see on the left side of the screen there, 2 Samuel. But if I scroll up just one verse there, you can see it just continues after the end of 1 Samuel 31, verse 13. Then they took their bones and buried them under the tamarisk tree in Jabesh and fasted 7 days after the death of Saul. And so it appears to just be continuous, especially in a technological version, as you see on my screen. Obviously, if you have a physical Bible, it is continuous as well, although typographic formulations will probably say 2 Samuel in bold, all caps, or some other way to distinguish it from 1 Samuel. But it's obviously within the same covers of the book, largely known as the Bible. The originals were separate scrolls, but perhaps only separate scrolls because a scroll could only be a certain length. If you haven't watched my videos on Luke, I would encourage you to go back and look at the one on Luke 4 when Jesus enters the synagogue in his hometown of Nazareth, where I show a couple of videos of a Torah scroll and creating a Torah scroll and what's actually involved in a big scroll like that, as well as the Isaiah scroll from Qumran that you can see laid out in a special climate and humidity controlled room. But for our purpose, it's probably enough to know that it's 1st and 2nd Samuel because it took two scrolls. In fact, in the Greek version, the Septuagint, the two books of Samuel and what we know as the 1st and 2nd book of Kings in the Bible are four books called kingdoms, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th kingdoms, as one continuous story from the beginning of 1st Samuel to the end of 2nd Kings. So there are those aspects, but there are also the aspects that scholars have uncovered, which suggest that this is certainly not written by one author at one time, but composed over time by a variety of authors in a variety of places with a variety of viewpoints. And that could take a whole series in itself, and many scholars have spent their entire career parsing which verse and which scene comes from which of the potential authors in which context. And I will not do that, or we'd be dragged down into the depths. And you might ask, why not just read it as we have it? Why not just read it straight through from 1 Samuel to 2 Samuel? Well, if you haven't watched any of my videos on 1 Samuel, I would encourage you to go back and watch the introductory one on that, where I cover a number of the issues involved. Because, as we know from any text, if we don't know when it was written, we don't know what perspective the authors might have had on the events that they're narrating in some past of their world, whether it's a recent past or a distant past. And you can see that in texts like Shakespeare, where he writes about Julius Caesar many centuries before his time, but also about British kings also before his time, but not so far before his time. But in any event, we can tell they're Shakespeare, and we can tell they're from Elizabethan England by the language and by some of the aspects of how the stories are told. And so similarly, scholars can parse some of the aspects of the books of Samuel by the language, as I tried to do at the end of 1 Samuel when I was showing how a number of the words used there are late words, in the sense that they're words understood to be part of biblical Hebrew from the exile or afterwards, which is to say from the 6th century BCE afterward, whereas the events in the story, the supposed reign of Saul and the reign of David, would take place in the 10th century, or perhaps the early 9th century BCE, which is to say several hundred years before that. So are we seeing an exilic perspective, or a post-exilic perspective, or a contemporaneous perspective, and for what purpose? Those are all questions, some of which I addressed in the introduction to the overall books of 1 Samuel, but now we have to look at a couple more. And so one thing we need to look at, as you can see on the map there, the events are taking place, as we'll see, and this map is specifically focused on, as you can see, 2 Samuel 2 to 6, and a piece at the end. But we're going to see that it starts with David back in the town that the Philistines gave him down in Ziklag, where Saul is dying with Jonathan up on Mount Gilboa, somewhere up in this area. It's not shown on this particular map because it takes place before the things that this map is trying to show. But when are we writing about those things, and what can we know? So here's one possible chart of it, and I note possible because I'm certainly not claiming knowledge here, and if you were to read the scholarship, you'd see, if anything, any consensus has been totally destroyed. Earlier scholarship was to say in the earlier 20th century or mid-20th century tended to see the pro and anti-monarchy elements as an expression of two different perspectives, sometimes called Samuel A and Samuel B, that somebody eventually edited together. And that view was taken as recently as Baruch Halpern in his powerful book, David's Secret Demons, where he incorporates, as few scholars do, the work of archaeology, which he's competent to evaluate, as well as the literary evidence as well. Samuel. But he's one of the few who do that. Really, more scholars have now taken to showing several different pieces, and that's what I'm showing here, although we'll see even this is problematic. So what you see in those little boxes are chunks of the text, and in the blue timeline, an approximate idea, at least from my viewpoint, of when they were written. And as you can see, they're written almost, but not completely, in the reverse order of the sequence of what they're telling, except for the first one. So we see here the Davidic apology, also known as the succession narrative, from 2 Samuel 8, after Nathan's promise that there would be somebody, in Yahweh's name, of course, not his own name, someone of the Davidic line on the throne forever, all the way through the succession to Solomon's son, Rehoboam, in 1 Kings 11. And I'm suggesting that story is the oldest continuous narrative written in the Bible, and it was written precisely to justify why Solomon was the successor of David, which is, when we get there, is not at all clear. He's one of a number of Davidic sons, and he's not the firstborn, and yet for some reason he takes the throne. And so when we get there, we'll have to see why. But the suggestion is that the entire narrative of David's monarchy and the succession of Solomon was there to justify an established monarchy with the kind of institutional representation that we see for the first time there. We did not see that in the Saul story, where Saul didn't have anything like a royal palace. He had a leader of his army in Abner, but we did not see any other officials. He doesn't have an official prophet, and he doesn't have anybody else that we know who performed the kinds of functions that an established monarchical regime would have. So he's really just someone who was selected by Samuel and made to be king, and then when power goes to his head, bad things happen, as we saw. So that story perhaps was written way later, and I'm going to suggest that that's part of this story here, sometimes called the Book of the Everlasting Covenant. David Jobling, who also called this section from Judges 2 to 1 Samuel 12 extended Judges, dealing with the period of Eli and Samuel that we saw before there's a king, and up to the ambivalence rather, about having a king in 1 Samuel 8 to 12. So that would be written after the fact, expressing ambivalence, perhaps in the time of exile, or perhaps maybe in the time of Josiah, when Deuteronomy and Joshua were almost certainly written to justify the so-called reforms of Josiah that you see in the later chapters of 2 Kings. But at the same time, the ongoing narrative of the kings, much less colorful than the stories of David and Solomon, with very few incidents, simply brief descriptions of war, and there are a few interesting stories, and there's Elijah and Elisha in there to challenge kings like Ahab. But for the most part, it's just this king lived and died, and another king lived and died, maybe one story told. But nothing like the complexity of character we see with David, nor the fine description of detail of the reign as we see of Solomon. So this composition seems to be a normal annals of kings being composed along the way up to the time of exile, or perhaps it was all put together at the time of exile to close it. It's hard to say. But I'd like to suggest that this extended Judges part was written before that, or roughly around the same time, perhaps from exile, perhaps the same time as Josiah. And then we know later a second version of this whole story, which we'll compare at times, because it covers up a lot of what is revealed about David that the authors of Chronicles don't want to tell. I'm going to try not to make moral judgments on that, although very few scholars refrain from deciding whether they personally think David's behavior is good or bad. But I think that's not the point. I think the point is for audiences to figure it out, and so I'm going to provide the evidence throughout, and you can decide for yourself whether you think David's being presented as a model of monarchy and a model of someone who Yahweh loves, or as something else, perhaps more complicated than that. So 1st and 2nd Chronicles, written almost certainly in the Persian period, along with Ezra and Nehemiah, to justify the Ezra and Nehemiah regime, which is to say the Persian control of what they call Yehud and the rebuilding of the temple under their control, whereas we see in Ezra the law of God and the law of the king are equated as what people need to follow. The most extreme version of this is from the minimalists, and I disagree with it personally, but you're entitled to know about it. And that's from a group of authors, Philip Davies and Keith Whitelam among them, who see it all written in the Hellenistic era to create a fictional past. And they're writing with an open agenda. They're writing with the agenda that the history of this area ought not just to be about quote-unquote biblical Israel, which is to say the portrait of Israel we see in the book of the Bible, as opposed to historical Israel, which they argue the Bible doesn't help us on. They suggest that the Bible as a whole is fiction, and anything we can know about historical Israel has to come from some other source, such as archaeology, of which there is not very much. So they suggest that the entire monarchy is post-exilic fiction to create a fictional past, and they're writing for the purpose of bringing forward Palestinian history, of not having the history of this region be subject to exclusive Jewish or Israelite viewpoints. And most scholars, apart from the politics of Israel versus Palestine, which at the time I'm making this video are extremely tense, disagree with their view because it simply doesn't support the evidence. And my view, put simply, although as we go along is more complex than that, is that why, if you were going to make up a fictional past, would you provide the incredible detail that we have in the Davidic story of his children and all the various incidents and the names of local characters? Perhaps that's just for verisimilitude, but there's plenty more going on in just creating a justification for why the later quote-unquote Jews get to claim the land as their own. There's certainly something more going on, and so very few scholars have accepted the minimalist view. There are some hints, though, that in addition to the possibility that these might have been written separately, that they're all connected at some level, certainly finally by whoever put them together in the form we have it. And here's one of the initial hints, that we can see that the books, as opposed to those continuous narratives that cross over the line of books like Extended Judges or the story of David across some of 1 Samuel and some of 2 Samuel, we see these parallels in how the books themselves are constructed. So not in the very first chapter, these are not in exact order as you can see, but they're all elements in there. At the very beginning, and we see that right here immediately on the left side of the screen, a man with his clothes torn and dirt in his head shows up, and he's going to tell about the death of Saul, and very similarly, almost identically, we see this here, and I'll show that parallel in more detail in just a moment. We also have at the beginning of 1 Samuel Hannah's song, which provides a trajectory for the book, and we have David's song of the bow, which is a very similar thing in the second scene of 2 Samuel. And interestingly, the ark of God causes trouble for the Philistines back in chapter 4 of 1 Samuel, and will cause trouble for a man named Uzzah in 2 Samuel. Saul's daughter Michal protects David via a window, where she lets him out via a window in 1 Samuel when her father is after him. But after David is seen dancing almost naked in the streets by the women in the streets, she despises David via seeing him through a window. And those are the only through window scenes in both books, and both of Michal seeing David or connected with David. Of course, one of the key points in 1 Samuel is the people demanding a king from Yahweh in chapter 8, and almost exactly in a parallel position is Yahweh promising a Davidic king forever via the prophet Nathan. So we have the prophet Saul here and the prophet Nathan here. I could have put that in as well. Following that, we have Saul becoming king and leading battles, and we similarly following that, we have David becoming king and leading battles. And both of them have a son turned against them all. Jonathan doesn't lead a rebellion exactly, but he certainly sides with David early on, so that his father calls him a bad name via insulting his mother. And David's son Absalom will, of course, die in the rebellion, leaving David to cry out, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son." And of course, one of the huge differences in the end, Saul and Jonathan die, and near the very end of 2 Samuel, David has a final victory song, which frames with Hannah's song up here, and perhaps, as some scholars suggest, provides a three-part frame of songs. Hannah's song at the beginning, David's song of the bow in the transition in the middle, and David's final victory song at the end. So those perspectives would certainly see that somebody saw these two books as a larger narrative as we have it. And one of the details to connect that, as I was just suggesting, is this parallel between the initial scene here, which is plainly drawing us back to the scene from 1 Samuel, as almost all scholars note. It's not just similar, but we see the almost identical language and a very similar point. So here we have a man of Benjamin specifically, and that will come up more later in our story, ran from the battle line and came to Shiloh the same day with his clothes torn and with earth upon his head. And here a man came from Saul's camp on the third day. Notice the extra detail of saying how long it was, with the exact same phrase, his clothes torn and dirt on his head. He says to Eli, or he says to David, "I have escaped from the camp of Israel. I've just come from the battle." And Eli and David both ask in the exact same language, "What is the word?" only in those two places in the books of Samuel. And the messenger responds, telling both that he's come from the battle, but that important people have died: Eli's sons Hophni and Phinehas, and Saul and his son Jonathan. So plainly, right from the beginning of 2 Samuel, we're expected to go back and listen to 1 Samuel and hear how this anticipated the fall of the house of Eli. Literally, Eli falls off his chair and the house of Eli falls because his sons are corrupt. And what will follow this is David picking up the remnants of the house of Saul and trying to figure out what to do with his children, as well as we'll see in 2 Samuel 2, a symbolic beginning of a war between the house of Saul and the house of David in the battle around the pool of Gibeon. So a number of things that make those connections. So we have to ask ourselves, whose perspective do we hear? Is it, in the most literal sense, David himself? As many scholars have continued to argue that the song we hear in the second half of 2 Samuel could be composed by David himself, just as it's traditionally understood that David composed at least some of the Psalms. That may be so, but there's no way to prove that, of course. There's no way to get outside of the text and ask if David himself wrote it. So assuming it's not David, it's some author, we have several possibilities. And note the partial and full elements of this. We can have a pro-Davidic author in support of a Jerusalem monarchy as a permanent institution, which is to say someone who likes 2 Samuel 7. Someone who says someone like David will be on the throne of the Jerusalem monarchy forever. We could also have someone who's pro-David, who thinks David is a swashbuckling hero at some level, but has mixed feelings about the monarchy as a larger project. So that might be reflected in the ambiguous behavior of David, not just the obvious adultery with Bathsheba and the having her husband Uriah killed, but the various other ways that David disclaims his connection with the violence. It's always a part of monarchy and empire as it develops, both externally and internally, and especially internally, he'll deny any involvement in it. So perhaps we have someone who likes David but has mixed feelings about the monarchy. Perhaps we have someone who doesn't like David and is responsible for portraying David not as a great hero, but as an adulterous, lying murderer who has mixed feelings about the monarchy. You don't like David, and you don't really think necessarily anybody could be better, but maybe somebody's better. Maybe you'd like Josiah better, because in the end, we'll see in 2 Samuel 22 and 23, Josiah is described by the narrator as there was never a king like him before, never a king like him after. So somebody likes Josiah best, but whether that person is also responsible for any of the writing of 1 and 2 Samuel, it's hard to say. And then finally, it could be an anti-Davidic, anti-monarchy author, someone who connected with 1 Samuel 8, really doesn't like the idea of a monarchy and is playing this out to show, this is what happens when you have a king. You end up with civil war and struggles and a king who thinks he's better than everybody else, etc., and that will lead to Solomon. And perhaps, as my last option has, as many scholars conclude without specifics, some combination of the above. And so I'm just going to leave it at that for now, trusting that some of this will play out as we go, that we really can't answer these questions definitively, but that you can begin to think about that as we go. So as we begin to look at the story with its first chapters around the sorting out of the house of Saul, but then its great drama with incest and rape and murder and betrayal, we can liken this to not just other biblical stories, but to great literature. As the political writers Halbertal and Holmes suggest that in this book is the beginning of politics, that there are no quote-unquote miracles in these stories. There's no parting of the Red Sea. There's no multiplication of loaves. There's no walking on water. There's the question of whether Yahweh is with people as they engage in the things that powerful people do, leading wars, killing their opponents, betraying or covering up or justifying their behavior. And so in that sense, it's perhaps like Shakespeare, like King Lear, performed in many ways with a king of mixed emotions and children of various persuasions. Perhaps similarly, it's like The Godfather, as I likened it was in the class that I taught when I was teaching at Seattle U, called King David, the Godfather in the United States. One story told three ways about how people rise up out of poverty and use violence to get there, but when they rise up, they have to come up with a new justification for why they continue to use violence at the top. And that certainly fits the David story as much as it fits Vito Corleone and as much as it fits the United States of America. And perhaps from a United States of America perspective, it's like a recent HBO TV show Succession, which doesn't involve the direct violence. We know that Logan Roy is never officially said to kill anybody, and yet if you've watched Succession, you know what they think about the people who serve on their cruise ships and work in their hotels and various things. No real people involved. Or perhaps, as the Korean scholar Koo Won has noted in his Asian biblical commentary on Samuel, but also in this article comparing 2 Samuel to the Asian classic Three Kingdoms, which he goes through great detail and highlights a classic that if you're not just Korean like him, but Chinese or Japanese or some of the other East Asian cultures, it's as essential to read to be an educated person as it would be to read Shakespeare among English-speaking people. And he shows there how it's a very similar story in many ways with similar elements, with an attempt to have divine legitimation, but without any sort of magic or miraculous acts of the divine. So as we go through this book, I hope you'll both see that it was written to entertain, much like those TV shows or films or classic Asian literature were meant to entertain, but also to lead the readers to reflect deeply on power. On God's power, on human power, on the power of violence and the power of persuasion, on the power of men over women and the power of powerful men over less powerful men. And we'll see how that all plays together as we begin our story with the next video. See you then for that. Bye-bye.